Okay, it is now my great pleasure to introduce another international speaker in Michael Every, who is the Head of Financial Markets with Rabobank. I'm particularly interested in hearing from Michael because he is one of the world's most respected ag economists, but with a little bit of a twist because he predicted the Trump presidency long before it ever happened, and also the trade tensions as a result. So today he's going to share some of his insights into that whole economic landscape, what it means, where it's potentially going, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Michael now to the stage.
Hello everybody, can you hear me okay? Yep. Fantastic. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful country again. I'm afraid I'm feeling somewhat jet-lagged, and I have the typical feeling that foreigners have when they land in Australia, which is I'm not sure what time it is or who the Prime Minister is. Hopefully I'll manage to get through the presentation okay. I have a feeling when it appears on the screen in a moment that it may get some of your heads spinning just the way that my head is spinning now at the moment, because as you've just heard, what I'm going to try and do is look at the current tensions between the US and China in terms of politics and trade, try and explain how we got where we are today, where we're going to go from here, and what it means for you guys out there. So that's what I'll be aiming for, and as soon as the technology is up and running, we will go. Oh, I'm in control. Sorry, there you go, you see? That's the jet lag. Right, before we begin, as is always the tradition of these things, can I ask everyone to stand for the National Anthem, please? That's quite enough of that. As you can see, the title of the presentation is A New Cold War, question mark. You can probably lose the question mark. And if so, what does it mean for all of us? Well, as I said, the record stops. Let's go back in history to understand where we are today. The last time that we had a major communist power arm wrestling with the US was the Soviet Union. And in 1917, just over 100 years ago, we had the Russian Revolution, and that shook the world. Now, the Russian Revolution, for those who remember it, back in those days, was the same equivalent shock to the global economy as if ISIS took over Germany or France or something like that. It was an absolute heart attack. And of course, you know, the US had to confront what was going on. The whole West had to. What I specifically want to focus on, though, is what do we mean by a communist economy? Well, first of all, the government owns everything and you can't leave. So if you wake up tomorrow and you don't own anything anymore and you can't leave the country, it's a bit of a giveaway you've become communist overnight. Until then, I wouldn't worry too specifically that Australia is going communist. But I want to look at 4 key pillars that actually tell us something about communism. And what you have here at the top, trade, which is a very important issue I'm going to come back to several times. If you're a communist economy, you practice autarky, meaning you try and do everything for yourself without any help from anybody else, or you practice mercantilism. Can we see any hands in the audience who knows what the word mercantilism means? 1 at the back. 2. Okay, I hope there's going to be a lot more by the end of this speech. Basically, mercantilism is the opposite of free trade. You run your country like a business. You sell and you don't buy. You sell high, you buy low, and you do everything you can to minimize buying from other people. Soviet economies used to do that. Monetary policy, that's your interest rate, irrelevant. The government would just create as much money as it needed from the central bank in order to fund any project it thought was important politically. Why is that important? Well, because your opponent can never go bankrupt. They can always borrow forever and never go under. Fiscal policy, irrelevant effectively, because the government would just create as much money as it needed. Whatever they wanted to build, they could build. There was a magic money tree. They never ran out. They could support companies left, right, and center forever. And in terms of workers, well, poor old Soviet workers, they could only buy goods made in the Soviet Union because of this mercantilism. And if they wanted to buy anything else that wasn't made there, they had to buy it on the black market. Now, you're probably thinking, why? Why am I talking about this? Well, the importance of that will come back shortly. What we do know, of course, is that post-World War II, we had a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US over which system worked better. Soviet communism, which I just showed you, or Western capitalism. And that battle raged all around the world with propaganda and various little low-level military conflicts as both sides prodded and prodded each other to try and take the leadership. Now, what's interesting is that while that was happening, capitalism transformed as a response to communism. Capitalism before World War II was extremely red in tooth and claw, if you will. There was no welfare state, not really. There was no government infrastructure spending, not particularly. And there was a lot of freewheeling capitalism, which led to the Wall Street crash in 1929. Post-World War II, everything's heavily regulated. We have a big welfare state, strict controls on the movement of money. Exchange rates don't move very much. Everything's regulated to hell. Now, you tell any Australian politician or global politician today, let's do that again, and they would say, that's madness, you'll destroy the economy. Well, actually, we had the biggest consumer boom in history when that was true, post-World War II. That's when we built the middle class in every Western country. Uncomfortable fact of history, but it's true. Now, the US won the Cold War against China by doing that, not by deregulated capitalism. But what's important is in the background, to beat the Soviets, they also did one thing. They made friends with the Chinese. In 1971, Richard Nixon, a very corrupt, controversial president who was ultimately impeached, went to China and made friends with them. Well, we've certainly got a controversial president who may be impeached today at the moment, but he's not trying to make friends with China. It's interesting how history echoes. China, post the Cold War, of course, became the West's friend. And the West, or the US at least, offered China a ladder to development within this global economy that they had built. And the global economy became increasingly deregulated. Neoliberal is a word that you often hear to describe it. Everything became open and free, a more free trade, free movement of money, free movement of goods and services. And China absolutely benefited from that. In 2001, they joined the WTO. They promised to obey the international rules, and they integrated very rapidly into the global economy. If you see here, the red slice is China's share of the global economy. And they are roaring back to where they were in the 19th century. Meanwhile, everything black and grey, which is the Anglo-Saxon economies, including down here, and the Brits and the Americans and the Canadians and the Kiwis, that's fading and fading away. Now, this is a story that you hear repeatedly told in a different way, talking about how the future is all based in China. Some variant on that particular chart. The key point I want to hammer home is China was invited to join this system. China didn't do it itself. This is not a Chinese success story. This is America giving China the blueprints to success in a world that they built after they won the Cold War. That's the key thing to remember. Then, of course, we had 2008, the GFC. Now, you didn't experience it down here. Everybody else certainly did. And effectively, the whole primacy and success of the American model comes tumbling down. Everyone starts wondering, really, is America number one? China certainly started to ask itself, is America number one? And increasingly the question was answered, no, it isn't. Now I'm going to turn to the Chinese economy, and you'll start to see why I looked back in order to look to where we are today. Because here are the same four pillars that I just showed you of a Soviet economy, the kind of economy that America had a Cold War with. And look at them. Bloody similar, to use a technical term. In terms of trade, China is not autarkic because it cannot feed itself, it cannot fuel itself, and it is reliant on raw material imports on a large scale. But they are heavily mercantilist. Very, very heavily. You guys are the lucky winners. You get to sell to China, and they like what you produce. Try selling anything to them that isn't a raw material or a food. Good luck with that. The UK sells more to Ireland than we do to China. Ireland, China. Do the math. Monetary policy in China is irrelevant. Nobody knows what the overnight cash rate is or the Fed funds rate. Nobody has any idea. It all depends how important you are. If you're important, you get to borrow at a very, very low rate and you can never go bankrupt. And if you're not, you borrow at a very high rate and you can go bankrupt. But if you're a key firm that you guys are competing against in business, in this global market, your competitor can never go bankrupt, no matter how badly they do. That's why that's important on monetary policy, and it's not fair. Fiscal policy in China, they pretend they run a very tight ship and that they worry about debt, and it's not true. The fiscal deficit in China, as a percentage of GDP, is around 12%. 12. That's worse than Greece on a wet Wednesday. In Australia, you're around 2, and you're constantly having kittens that it's too high. 12 in China. So the government just throws money at things repeatedly, all the time, and just covers it up by doing it off book. The only part of the Chinese economy that looks like a Western economy, that's compatible with the global economy that America let them into, is the consumer, the workers. If you can get through their trade barriers, which is bloody hard to do, and you can sell to them, there's a fantastic consumer market there. That's the carrot they dangle to everybody, and you guys are global winners in being able to do that. But one of the messages I want to get across to you today is you are a rare and isolated case. Most people cannot manage to do that. So it's a carrot that's dangled that most people can never get to. Now, things get worse when you consider that China is politically very different from us. We have to accept that fact. You know, countries are run differently. In China, you can't use Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp. Harry Potter's a threat to national security. So is Peppa the Pig for some reason. Winnie the Pooh, also very dangerous to national security. All these things are banned. I'm not joking. They only let in 34 Hollywood films a year and not usually the good ones. Now, you can say, fair enough, every country's different, fair enough. But one other thing they've started to do now is take Chinese censorship and move it globally. If you're a company, you want to do business in China, what you say and what you do internationally has to meet with Beijing's approval, or you lose access to the Beijing Chinese market. If you're an academic publisher, what you publish in English in Australia has to conform to what China says about its own history and the world, or you can't sell in China. So Chinese censorship doesn't stay in China. They are exporting it. Be aware of that, and it's raising tensions. Then we have this issue. I'm sure you're familiar with this. This cow's tongue here is licking up the South China Sea. Now, the simple fact of the matter is everything inside this cow's tongue either belongs to China, if you're Chinese, or it belongs to everybody else and it's international waters, if you're everybody else. Simple as that. Lots of tensions over that. If we confront China, things are going to get very, very nasty. And if we don't, we've sent the international message that might makes right, and if you've got a big enough army and navy, you can take whatever the hell you want in international territory, and there's nothing you can do about it. Neither of them are particularly palatable choices, but unfortunately, they're looming in the background, and they are very important for Australia. Now, nothing here is new. Nothing here is new, but everything's got worse in the past 12 months because of this. At the end of last year, we had the 19th Party Congress in China, which is kind of like their electoral cycle, if you will. Every 5 years, they get a new leadership emerging. And this one was extremely triumphalist. If you translate it into English, that's what they said. The New World Order cannot just be dominated by capitalism in the West, and time will come for a change. Their words, not mine. And then they said, by 2050, we're going to be global number one. Make China great again. That was effectively what they said last year. And the simple message, even if you look through the rhetoric, is China wants to be number one, and that's their right. They're absolutely entitled to say they want to do that. But they want the rest of the world to look more like them rather than they looking more like us. So just accept that as fact, because it's what they say loudly in capital letters, if you will. Of course, things got even worse slightly afterwards because President Xi Jinping decided to unilaterally change the Chinese constitution and become president for life, rather than just another 5 years. So effectively, insert your picture here, the next big man politics. It's not a surprise to me, against that backdrop, that the US is now pushing back against this. They don't like China's economic model, they certainly don't like China's political model, and they don't want to see China's political model exported anywhere else alongside a growing Chinese economy. So they have now put forward a new national defense strategy. And they openly say, great power competition has returned, 19th century style, between China and Russia and the US. And China is primary in their thoughts. How are they intending to win? Because America is not saying this expecting to lose. Well, they are going to integrate all elements of American national power: political, economic, military. Their words, not mine. So don't sit there and say business is business, politics is politics. Nonsense. The most powerful country in the world has just told you business is politics. And the military is also business and politics. They are all together and united. And if you think Trump's mad, Trump's stupid and crazy to be doing this, how the hell do you think the Chinese think? Exactly the same. So now you have number one and number two in the world, both uniting politics, economics, and military together. And that makes for turbulent times, shall we say. Now, here comes this great revolutionary leader in the US, and he's rolling out the big guns. And here is what we have seen. About 6 to 9 months ago, we had tariffs on solar panels and washing machines, and everyone said, shock horror, washing machines, shock horror, solar panels. Then we had 50 billion in tariffs on China. Then Trump killed the company ZTE, it's a big Chinese electronics firm, then he brought it back to life. And now we've had threats and actual implementation of another 456 billion in tariffs. In total, everything China makes will be under tariff from the US. They've banned China Mobile from the US. They've banned Huawei, a big tech firm from the US. Australia has done the same, by the way. There are controls on Chinese foreign investment going in. There's now also, critically, an industrial policy for defense, which I'll come back to in a moment. And effectively, it's no secret. We now have a Cold War between the two. This is not a trade spat. It's not going to go away. It's not something small. It's a Cold War. And it's only going to escalate, in my view. Now, China is extremely confident that it's going to win. If you look here at the rhetoric, the Russian, by the way, says, forward, victory is close. For months, China has been repeating, look, we're big, we're China. We don't do losing. All we ever do is achieve our targets year after year after year, because communism and the planned economy works brilliantly. We know that, right? That's the historical record everywhere else in the world. So you see this rhetoric coming out. Don't mess with China, because we will win. But all I can say is 2 + 2 = 5 in China. My entire career has basically been looking at it, and the one message I can say more clearly than anything else is yes, 2 + 2 = 5. Don't believe the hype. Really dig below the surface. Look at the really important numbers, not what you see on the surface. Because what I see underneath is a complete mismatch, geopolitically, between the US in one corner and China in the other. If you're talking about geography, who would you rather be? If you're talking about resources, who would you rather be? Politics, okay, you can laugh at American instability and polarization. What's the historical track record of one-man rule for life? How many countries can you name that have done well with one-man rule for life? Dig out your history books, send me an email, tell me how long the list is. It won't take very much time. Demography, who's going off a cliff faster? Well, China. China looks like Japan, they're just a little bit younger. Where are all the best universities in the world? It's not China. Who's growing faster? China. Yeah, but 2 + 2 = 5 if you really do the digging. Where's it easier to do business? Who's got less debt? Amazingly, America's got less debt than China. And importantly for you guys, who's got a stronger trade position and currency position, which really does impact on your businesses? And the answer again is the US, not China. Let's look at the currency position first of all. China lives and operates in a US dollar prison or a US dollar world. They want the whole world to use their currency, including you. They would love to pay you for your products in Chinese renminbi. Hands up, who would like to be paid in renminbi? Overwhelming vote of confidence. Yes, that's what's happening all around the world. Everybody still wants to be paid in dollars. Ergo, the global reserve currency is in the dollar. And China does not have the whip hand on that front. The renminbi is still irrelevant. That really matters in trade struggles, as I will show in a moment. It really matters. And it matters because of this. This is possibly the most important chart you will see anywhere this year. Not trying to overhype it, but I'm not seeing enough people talk about it. What you have here is a Russian propaganda poster on the right-hand side, and it says, "Capitalists of the world unite." And the interesting thing is, China gets to basically build bridges to nowhere and white elephant projects everywhere and run fiscal deficits of 12% of GDP and do whatever it wants and always meet its targets because they earn enough dollars by selling everything to the rest of the world that they can protect their economy with a firewall around it, built of US dollars. Have a look at the chart. Who do they earn those dollars from that protect their economy from the predations of the West? Well, it's the US and it's Europe. Australia, for example, has a healthy surplus with China, which is quite rare. Now, let's take away the US and take away Europe if we have a Cold War. That's what China's trade position looks like. You know what the difference between Turkey is and China? That trade position. So that's what's at stake if Trump really pushes ahead with this Cold War and really starts trying to push and squeeze China on the trade front. Now let's go back to what I said about the industrial policy. Recently, we saw another story break that China had inserted tiny, tiny microchips the size of a pencil head or a pinhead into circuit boards in products they were making in China and selling to electronics firms in the US. You may have seen that. That story is a disaster for China, whether it's true or not. If you're an American firm, you can no longer keep your supply chain in China. You cannot. You can't take that security risk. You have to move out. And the Americans themselves have just published this particular report called Assessing and Strengthening the Manufacturing and Defense Industrial Base and Supply Chain Resiliency of the US. Very boring. What it says in a nutshell is free trade and globalization don't work with national security. Because if you treat your national defense as a free market, you'll end up with China making all the widgets that go into your planes and your aircraft carriers. At which point, the next time you do have a conflict with them over the South China Sea, you can't take off because China's got all your joysticks or your microchips. It's madness. And you know what? They're absolutely bloody right. If you've got any kind of political beef with another country and you think at any point in the future there could be tension, why are you running free trade with them? Why are you saying markets rule? It's insane. Are you going to say, could you please deliver the joysticks next month because we're expecting to fight a war with you by the end of the year? It's not going to happen. So what they've said quite clearly is that these reasons here, highlighted in black, the decline of US manufacturing capability and capacity, the industrial policies of competitor nations, and diminishing US skills in high tech, all flow from free trade with China. And as a result, China represents a significant and growing risk to the US supply chain of the materials they need for national security. And you don't mess with national security. In many cases, Chinese firms are becoming the only company that produces one particular part, which will always happen in a free trading relationship. Capitalism will push you to one lowest cost producer, and it tends to be China. And the US has said, no more of this. We won't let it stand. National security says we need to take supply chains back into the US. Now, of course, you guys don't make microchips. You make products that go into real chips, which is, infinitely preferable. But this backdrop is extremely important for everything that's going to happen vis-a-vis trade globally. Because effectively, what the Americans are saying are, niet, no more free trade. National strategy is far more important than saying markets over everything else. Whenever national security comes in, markets are going to go out the window. And this is going to be the prevailing atmosphere in the US, and it already is in China. It's always been that in China, always will be. What does it mean for you? Well, effectively, everyone now in the US, policy circles, and in China are looking at the globe and they're thinking, who's on our side and who isn't? They're putting pins in maps. And what you can see is that the US is already reworking trade to its own advantage. We've recently had a new trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada. You've probably heard about that. So the NAFTA deal went out the window, and we now have the USMCA, which makes me think of that song. USMCA. I won't sing it. I've already done enough singing. But what's interesting is within the USMCA, they have a higher local content provision. You have to make more in North America. There are caps on how much Canada and Mexico can ever sell to the US. Now, they're much higher than where they are now, for cars, for example. But there's an ultimate limit to how much they can sell. So investment is not going to flow to them in an infinite way. Only some will. There's a ban on currency manipulation. So you can't push a currency down. Who's accused of doing that usually? China. It's not actually true anymore, but it's a US stick that they bash them with sometimes. And importantly, in that particular new NAFTA, you can't have a free trade deal with China. You can't have a free trade deal with a non-market economy, and that is China and nobody else. Now, right now, of course, you can say, well, that's North America. But the US has said they're going to renegotiate with the EU and the UK. They announced that yesterday. I expect the same terms to come through with them. I also expect them to come back and say, we're going to do the TPP again. We're going to come back in, and we want the same terms as we have in the new NAFTA, which is no deals with China. Sorry, national security. So effectively, you can stay in the US loop with limits, but national security means no China within that loop. Now I start to see the furrowed brows. I think now you start to understand what I'm saying. Now, if you don't like that deal and you say, well, look, frankly, that's just silly. We like free trade. We like China. Great. Kiss goodbye to American military bases. Say hello to Chinese ones. Because global geopolitics are going to revolve around that. Now, at the moment, the agri sector is not national security for the US. But do you really think they're going to pay to protect this region, not be able to sell to China, and sit and watch you guys make lots of money selling to China? I don't think they're going to let you eat their lunch forever if they're the ones propping up the region militarily. It's not particularly fair in their eyes. Now, Australia, as we know, has its own path to socialism. Fantastic poster I found there from the 1950s. And that is your vulnerability to how much you sell to China, whether it's iron ore, whether it's dairy, whether it's food, the wonderful food that you guys grow, whether it's education, whether it's tourism, whether it's cotton, whether it's housing. We know that China really, to be blunt, has you by the short and curlies. That's the way it works. But the more you sell to them, the more vulnerable you are. So you walk away and it hurts. You stay in, the more you can get hurt when this eventually and inevitably gets worse. That's the unfortunate reality that we find ourselves sitting in. And the worst thing is, if you want to say, Mike, please go away with your jet lag, please go back. We don't want to imagine, we want to imagine this isn't happening. Is there a scenario where there's no trade war? Yes, there is, and you won't like that either, because we've already seen floated the only deal, short term, by which the US and China become friends again, is if we do a short-term deal for China to buy loads more US energy and loads more food and agri from the US to try and rebalance trade. I think it's a stupid deal if they do that. But if the US do go down that path, the Chinese press have already said, well, in that case, we'll dump Aussie products and we'll buy US because there's a finite demand and we'll go for them rather than them. Because frankly, you don't threaten them and the US does. So even in the positive scenario where the trade war goes away, you still won't like it. Now, what does this mean for you, besides the fact you hate every word I say? Well, first of all, the first conclusion is be proactive. Do not just sit there and think, well, I keep selling more and more to China and this is wonderful. Take advantage of the fact that for now, you're in TPP 2.0 and the US isn't. You have a wonderful window of opportunity to be a first mover and to be getting into those markets like Japan, wonderful, lucrative markets that you've ignored for far too long, I think, really, and start to re-establish yourself there before the US comes chasing after you in 6, 9, 12 months, 24 months or whatever. But secondly, look around you in the region and globally and think, if there is this Cold War, if we start playing Risk and moving pieces around on the board, who's going to be on our team? Who's a great market with great potential? Maybe it's not as easy to sell to as China. Maybe the money isn't as good. Maybe the risk is slightly higher. But who can we sell to offer an alternative market to diversify so this risk goes away? And you know what? It's a long list because you've got a great product. I'm such a big fan of Australian agriculture and Australian food and agri in general that as a vegetarian, last time I was here, I started eating steak again. It's absolutely true, and I intend to do it. Yeah, absolutely. So you've got a great product. I'm physical proof of it, okay? But you need to be more proactive rather than just relying on China. Look at the map. Indonesia, for one. I'm just throwing darts at a board. Big target to hit. India. Are these hard work? Yes. Will they be worth it in the future? Absolutely. So don't be complacent and just rely on one. That's a firm piece of advice that I'm trying to give. Be proactive rather than reactive. But I think the opportunity there is absolutely enormous. Secondly, accept that there is going to be this backdrop of national security. Your politicians are going to continue to talk about free trade, and it's nonsense. They do the same in Europe because they're also big net exporters. It's nonsense. National security will be primary, foremost in everybody's mind in the global environment going forward. And is national security part of agriculture in Australia or the other way around? Is agriculture part of your national security? I think it is. I think it is. And I think you have a strong argument to be talking to your politicians and say, well, in this particular global environment, why aren't you doing more to help us? If everybody else is going to be going this route, why are we saying free trade and having no help whatsoever? Which I think actually could be, greatly helpful to you. And the second conclusion is this. Unfortunately, the new Cold War is here to stay. The trade war is just part of it. It's not a spat, it's a war, and it's only part of it. It could get far worse. There are no easy outs. I wish there were, because I'd love to give you one. Market volatility is going to rise. Interest rates are going to move around all over the place. Exchange rates are going to move around all over the place. The Aussie dollar, in particular, could get a lot weaker, which I think is good news for you. But importantly, as a business, as a sector, as a country, think ahead. Pick a side before you're picked. You're in a much stronger position if you can pick. And as this Soviet soldier here says, echoing a very famous American poster. Я готов к работе в зимних условиях готов ли ты? I'm ready to work in cold war conditions. Are you? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the key question. And now the obligatory 10-minute standing ovation. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah, sure.
Awesome, thank you. Well, that was a cracking presentation. Another one. Gosh, what a fantastic conference we've had. There was lots of words that I learnt a lot about in that presentation, but I think the key thing is we need to be thinking about diversifying our markets, because I guess one of the last phrases that Michael shared was pick or be picked. And I think with the complexities of the global trade and political and economic systems, we need to be mindful of that. So thank you very much, Michael.